So I think what's happening is that line between making and managing is just blurring completely.
Hey everyone, I'm Scott. I'm the editor-in-chief here at LeadDev, and I'm going to be having a conversation today with Mik Kersten, who is a CTO and founder and the author of 2018's Project to Product. He now has a new book coming out called Output to Outcome, and I'm going to talk to him today about the big ideas in it, especially regarding the future of software engineering management and leadership, because these are the topics that I'm really interested in at the moment. I just launched a new newsletter on Substack called The Shift, which is all about that shift from what Mik's about to talk to, which is going from that project to product world to the output to outcome world, and how AI is rapidly changing how we think about organizations, how we think about building software, how we think about delivering it. But before we get into all that stuff, Mik, how you doing today?
Doing well. Thank you, Scott. Great to be chatting about this topic.
Awesome. So you open the book with a quote. The quote is, "This is the end of coding as a profession." I guess my first question today is, do you think that's the case? Do you agree with that quote?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this was that book opens with a quote from a conversation I was having with Rod Johnson, who's very well known in open source circles, creator of the Spring Framework. Who's now got a new startup around AI, around helping Java developers, which is really where Spring came from, apply agentic development in AI. And he said this right after that, right after that 2022 ChatGPT demo, when we were both chatting, going, "This is amazing at writing code." And if you extrapolate where it could go, we did not know about reasoning models and what we have today with Claude Code and everything else. But just extrapolating how good it was, how much it had improved in the 6 months since some of the APIs were available, made Rod say that, and I immediately agreed with him. So I think, and some of this is just how good the fact that programming languages are just another very well structured language. What we were realizing is that this is just going to keep getting better and better, and I think the answer is yes. The sessions I have with Claude Code or others might have right now, or with Codex or something of the sort, they're not programming as we used to know it. So I think that profession, and it's not exactly candle making, right? When electricity came along, there's still lots to do around when electricity came along around giving people light. So there's still a ton of software to be built, but not in the way that Rod and I formed our careers as developers. So.
Yeah, I heard a writer the other day compare it to like not knowing how to do typesetting, which kind of like lodged in my head a little bit. It's not perfect analogy. No analogy is, but it kind of makes sense to me. It is transforming right in front of our eyes, and I think even the terminology of like programmer is going to get dated really quickly here, but it doesn't necessarily change what the job is, and I think that's really the point of your book, right? So my next question was, what drove you to write another book? Because I personally couldn't imagine sitting down and writing a book right now. I've got a 3-year-old. Life's pretty busy. But also, when you sat down to write the book, like, where did you turn to stress test these ideas, or like kind of find examples in the wild of this really happening?
Yeah, so I guess what motivated me is I'd seen organizations going obviously through that whole phase of digital and agile and cloud transformation, and the point of Project to Product was to help them implement a product operating model that would make these transformations work, right? The problem was people are just transforming their teams and not really their organization. And I think that's why we end up with this world of organizations that could innovate very quickly with software, like tech giants, hyperscalers, new startups, and organizations that couldn't. And then I realized this was happening again and just layering over itself. So the organizations that were set up with an effective product operating model, the right kind of team structures and platform engineering practices, all these sorts of things that we think around modern technology organizations, they were just much better at leveraging AI, right? They already had teams that were more empowered, right? So rather than someone having to take 6 months to make a centralized decision of what Gen AI solution we're going to go with, what vendor and so on, that empowered their teams to experiment. So they were moving faster, right? The teams were already more connected into organizational outcomes. And that's really part of empowerment, right? If a team's empowered, they're empowered to deliver outcomes, not just to ship features and those sorts of things. So of course, when the amplification from AI came, those organizations that were structured with a product operating model were already able to leverage that more quickly. And so I basically saw organizations that were structured this way moving really much faster in adopting AI at whatever stage it was at, initially like code completion, then more agentic stuff, and it just kept going. And again, there being an even bigger divide between those sort of older, more legacy incumbents and how quickly these tech companies were going, which I think is a really, so that's kind of what I was observing, which I see as a problem, because of course, as in my job, I was helping modernize these other organizations. And I kind of see it as a big societal problem, because what it leads to is a very small number of companies who kind of provide all the innovation and provide all of the, if you extrapolate this, concentrate all this wealth and power, whereas we know economies and job landscapes and all those things are much better if that innovation is diffused across the economy. So what I had this motivation of realizing, okay, well, project to product is, I think it's an important foundational piece, but it's not enough to thrive in the age of AI. So then I went down this research journey of going, well, what else is needed to create an effective operating model for the age of AI that will help you thrive, that will allow you to leverage this power in a way that an AI native would? And how do we get that to as many companies as possible, as quickly as possible? So that was kind of the inspiration for the book. So.
Yeah, and you use the term AI native, and I think that is the goal for a lot of organizations. I think a lot of folks kind of want to be in that bracket, but I don't think it's like particularly well understood. So like when you were kind of looking around for AI native companies, what kind of qualities are you looking for?
Well, when I started looking, there were very few of them, right? You basically had the frontier labs, right? And this was still being adjusted. And so this goes back to your earlier question, is how I looked for the pieces, because all of this is changing, which pieces organizations really look to implementing, which they shouldn't. So when the book, by the way, took me, basically, I probably spent 3 times the hours of writing it as I spend of project to product, because it's deeper, it's broader, and it's just a more challenging and interesting problem space. How do you structure your organization and your systems and your mechanisms to leverage AI? So I think the core foundation of the book is that we can actually, from first principles, extrapolate some of these things. So the book assumes that productivity for kind of digital software, intangible assets, our ability to deliver those will go up by 10, 100x, right? Something like that, maybe at some point 1,000x. So that's just a core assumption baked into the book, and all the principles behind it. And then the question is, okay, well, how do we actually leverage that? Because the data that we have, and this is data from things like this project to product state of the industry report that we ran, indicates that enterprises have a bottleneck that's outside of development teams. So you could today 2x the productivity of those development teams and get very little increase in output or outcomes. And we can kind of tease apart those things in a second. Whereas, again, you take a digital native or an AI native, these highly effective elite organizations, and you double the capacity of development teams, so let's say 2x the teams, you'll get approximately 2x the output, right? So the issue is, what now, if you 10x the capacity, let's say at a Microsoft or something else, will you get 10x the output? Probably not. There's still the question is, what are the other constraints? So at the whole core of the book is, what it says is the theory of constraints, which says a system can only really move as fast as its slowest, as its bottleneck, right? As its main constraint. What is the new constraint? Once your output, the ability to deliver output through code or other, again, digital initiatives, is 10x, there's 100x. And the constraints, I believe, and the data shows, become organizational. What's stopping that delivery? Is there a missing feedback loop to how quickly you can deliver, and so on. And then the book is really around, okay, how do we resolve that constraint? How do we restructure the operating model of the organization to allow for that 10 or 100x? But some things, for example, the book doesn't, obviously we don't know the answer to yet, right? So how exactly you structure the teams? Is it going to be, it's probably not going to be 2 pizza teams. And of course, I discussed this in the book, but maybe if it's not 2 pizza teams, maybe it'll be 1 pizza teams, or maybe it'll be one, for software, it'll be 1 product manager and 1 engineer running a fleet of agents. So I think it's too early to know the exact shape of the teams, But the shape of the organization, I think we can actually derive from first principles. So wherever you end up with between two pizza teams or one person teams or one person running $100 million business, again, that'll take time to discover. I think we have to put the right kind of organizational structures around that amplified output that an individual and a team can deliver, and then how that comes together.
And so you wanted to, you mentioned about teasing apart the difference between an output and an outcome. And I feel like that's probably the most important first step here for us to get into kind of the thesis of the book. But yeah, explain to me the difference between an output and an outcome in this context.
Yeah, and I'll kind of relate it to, I think, the fact that through my career, through the careers of many people interested in developer productivity and organizational productivity, it's really been around delivering outputs, right? So outputs are the number of lines of code, the number of features, the number of agents, the number of digital assets that an individual or a team can deliver. So previously, in this age of software and digital that we've been living through for roughly the last 50 years, we've been, ever since kind of the microprocessor and software, organizations have been constrained around how much they could produce, the outputs that they could create, right? Which is why you saw anywhere from tech companies to the Ubers of the world to the biggest banks, they were extremely focused on hiring developers and developer productivity, right? And that's how these banks end up with tens of thousands of developers, because that was really their constraint. Now, so the constraint was delivering these outputs. Now, what we're actually getting with AI, because it's so good at creating software and digital assets, is I think that outputs will no longer be the constraint. So really, any business, its goal is to deliver some kind of outcomes, right? The customer outcomes, employee outcomes, together those make up business outcomes. So I think given that, and this is where in output to outcome, I introduced this notion of an outcome loop, right? We've got inputs to what a team, a value stream can deliver. Those are budgets and a strategy. We've got the outputs that are produced. Those are the lines of code and assets, all the basically artifacts and activities that the team produces as they're working. And then there are the outcomes, those business and customer and employee outcomes. And all of a sudden, what's happening is that output part of the loop is now being amplified by, let's just call it 10x. So the question is, with all that additional output, what's happening? Are you delivering 10x the outcomes? Are you actually delivering more slop? Are you delivering systems that are not sufficiently stable, and you're actually introducing security vulnerabilities, or you're introducing stability issues because you've not kind of put behind it the right sort of engineering principles? And so what output to outcome says is, okay, it's no longer just about managing to the constraint of producing outputs. Those will no longer be the constraint. It really is around making sure that those outputs deliver the right outcomes, and then making sure we feed that back to the strategy and the budget. So it's really around kind of turning that innovation crank much faster like we can with agents, but making sure that we always have this connectivity between output and outcome to make sure that we're delivering substance and not slop.
And which organizations do you think are kind of uniquely set up to win in this era? I'm guessing it's not software as a service companies.
Well, so that's a really interesting question. So obviously, let's just start with the kind of AI natives, right? Which, if you're born in this very new era, you're probably set up to thrive in this era, right? So I start in the book. The book has, by the way, these 10. As you've read, Scott, these 10 models, 3 foundational ones, and these 3 shifts, where one of the shifts is the one I allude to right now, is the slop to substance shift. So what's really happening is that, for each of those shifts, I want to illustrate it. And so I took a case study of an AI native to show how much things change when you're no longer optimizing for outputs, but optimizing for outcomes. And that case study in the book is Cognition AI. So one of the amazing things that you can do with AI is, what we're used to, if output's the constraint, you're prioritizing roadmap items very carefully. You're really managing to that constraint, right? That's what you always do in a large scale system with a big constraint like that. How Cognition AI, and they create Devin and have the Windsurf IDE, they work very differently. So because they're less constrained on output, they can actually run this outcome loop in parallel. So basically every week, they run it very fast. It's not, they've got a feedback cycle with their customers that's weekly. not monthly or quarterly. And every week, they actually produce more models and experiments than they ship. So the way to look at this is that they're able to produce so many different experiments of what might be great for their customers, what might delight their customers, that at the end of the week, because they have this meeting on Sundays, they throw away most of what they've built, which is just a completely different way of looking at it. They've got a surplus of outputs they can work with because they're using their own technologies, their own agentic development. And that means that they can actually just entirely focus on that outcome loop and what it's delivering. And in the process, throw away more of what they built, which again is the opposite of the way most large scales, even SaaS companies work, right? So I think that's just a great example of how when you're structured for that, you can actually run, because in the end, this outcome loop is a hypothesis testing loop. We actually never know exactly what features will delight our customers the most, which will cause the most stickiness or the most success for our customers. They're actually running that outcome loop in parallel. So that's kind of like a great sort of endpoint and goal, which is why I put that case study early in the book. SaaS companies are structured around software being the constraint, right? And I think here's where we need to sort of tease apart a little bit the sort of the business that the companies are in. The SaaS companies have been in the business of providing these workflow products, and then how they actually build those products. Are they building them in traditional ways, as in developers are the constraint, or do they actually have this outcome orientation? So I think where SaaS companies, just to address the first one, which is kind of the outcomes they're delivering for their customers and really the products they're delivering for those customers, those products need to change completely, right? It's now, as agents consume more of them, it's going to be less around screens and more around kind of headless consumption by agents and so on. So I think everyone is in that shift, and of course trying to understand what value do they offer over top of the models, how much harness versus a user experience they are, and so on. So there's that huge reckoning. Now, of course, I want all these SaaS companies and others to be successful in this. So I think the faster they can shift how they build software and how they iterate with customers, the more successful they'll be at delivering that. And that was definitely my experience working as Chief Technology Officer of PlanView, right? Is very quickly pivoting us as we created our first agentic framework in early 2023, pivoting us to adopting that for our own development. And I think this is the tricky thing, that these companies actually need to do both things. Basically, rewire their operating model around AI and then recreate their products. So it's just I think it's why the people we talk to are so extremely busy right now, because they all have to do both things at the same time.
Yeah, and they're oil tankers, right? Like, Salesforce, absolutely enormous. ServiceNow, absolutely enormous. Like, a lot of these SaaS companies have been very, very successful, which means that they are oil tankers, and that is going to be difficult. We're seeing how difficult it is for them to turn around. Like, I think just like this week before we had this conversation, Claude came out with Claude Design, and like the implications that has for a company like Figma is massive. Like the speed of disruption for a bunch of SaaS companies right now is pretty like whiplash inducing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think what's been extremely tricky for people about this year, really, the 2026, is that you're seeing these, at first it was just the SaaS companies, right? The ones providing those workflow solutions like the ServiceNows, the Atlassians, the Asanas, and so on, right? But then it was, this was kind of obvious before 2026, but as soon as you started seeing verticals like design, like insurance, and so on, being addressed by, especially by Anthropic, I think people realize that disruption is not just for SaaS. The disruption, they can go after nearly every vertical. Mm-hmm. So again, I think you're dealing with this sort of dual disruption. One is how the product offering relationships to how consumers and enterprises use products, which is really boils down to how much, I think, do they use the model itself and what they're getting from the frontier model provider versus what you add on top of the model versus all the data sets and those sorts of things that these companies do have, right? Which is an important asset of theirs that needs to be accessed. So that's one side, and Output Telecom is not really about that, right? I think it just assumes that this, and it talks about this at the start, is that disruption is going to be faster than anything we've seen before because of just the nature of AI. And so you your business model and your products are going to get disrupted. And output comes really at that second part is how do you structure your organization to deliver at that speed of an AI native in this age? Because you can't, one of the things I see these companies doing is placing these massive bets. Early on they'll place the bets. Okay, let's change our whole experience to be chat based, or let's change the footprint to be of the product to be smaller, or part of it to be chat based. Those in the end are all disruptive plays to address disruption. And if you do those as kind of this big bang without a feedback loop, it actually becomes extremely risky, right? You don't know if you need to learn quickly to understand how the next model release is affecting your customers, or is it actually helping them move to your product or away from your product. So what we've learned around managing disruption is you actually need to set up these, in the book, I call them actually outcome domains, is where you need to have something where you're incubating the next thing around the next capabilities of the model, or where you think those next capabilities of the models will be. You need to have a transformation zone, which is really bringing something new to your core customers, while, of course, you've got this challenge, this boat anchor that you mentioned, of your cash cows, right? Which is where your revenue is coming from currently. And this is a bit like that disruption of software and cloud and digital that we saw 20 years ago, but it's just moving so much faster. So the feedback would be faster.
Yeah. And in this era, in this age, like, do you think that the best organizations would benefit from sort of deep focus or unbounded curiosity? And the reason I ask this is because I'm currently kind of seeing OpenAI grapple with this themselves. I think all of the foundational labs are grappling with this. It's like we can do anything, as you just said, but like, is it smart for us to do that? And you can see OpenAI start to pull back on some of its kind of moonshot ideas already and start to really just refocus on, okay, how do we beat Claude in the coding domain? How do we win in the white collar, like, enterprise world? And so I think back to like the Internet 2.0 era, so which was the last big disruptive era in this industry. And you think of someone like Netflix that was like just very, very focused on a singular idea, and that was very, very successful. But then there's other companies that had this idea of let's have as many ideas as possible and we'll let the best ones win. Me and you talked about this offline, this idea of like kind of the pit from The Dark Knight Rises, where the best idea rises to the top, and you just kind of allow these small teams with agents to come up with as many experiments as possible, and then you sort of cull the weakest ones and stick with the best ones. I don't know, those are the two models that I've got in my head. Do you see one of those being kind of uniquely suited to this era?
I think that's a super interesting question. I think what underlies those two models is the successful instances of both models. Where let's say like that first model is Netflix pivoting from DVDs to streaming, right? The second model is I don't know. Let's take that OpenAI, where they've got trying many things. Sora's making less money or whatever's happening, so they decide Sora's gone, and they need to compete around codecs and coding. So I think the successful instances of those, and I think it's a really good point, Scott, is like what we saw in that like kind of Internet 2.0 era is a lot of companies who did that right and a lot of companies who did that wrong. And that aspect of things, and this is kind of part of the point of output to outcome, is we've seen some of this movie before, but it's just very different because how much faster it's moving. So I think we actually can use some of those sort of innovation disruption strategies from that past era to this one, where even in the case of Netflix, right, they really iterated quickly. They could have learned that no one will ever stream anything. Of course, that's not the case, and then pivoted to something else, right? And they were very incremental about it, and there was just a ton of hypothesis testing. It just from the outside, it probably looks like they placed one big bet, right? But they were very incremental at the start. One of the people who I think he's told me a lot of the story, and he's actually I have a conversation with him that's reflected in the book Output Outcome, is Aidan Cockcroft. He created their cloud architecture, and he really was responsible in understanding how that scaling would work. Like if they couldn't scale it, or it'd take another few years to scale it, it would have been a different story. but they were able to very iteratively, and this is really where we get back to the speed of decision making, right? Is they had that feedback loop between sort of the customer problem, customers want to watch movies, or the solution, and the technical side of the solution, which is, do we send DVDs or do we use really slow bandwidth to the home at that point, and optimize around that. And they were able to crank that feedback loop very quickly. So they still operated on very much on this outcome loop. And some of my inspirations for that outcome loop actually came from Adrian Cockcroft, because he then did a lot of that at work at AWS as well as what I built in my own organizations and other colleagues' organizations. So they did that, and that was really iterative, kind of around one solution domain. OpenAI or these large organizations, it's not one bet, right? But what you're getting is based on outcomes. In the case of Netflix, subscribers. In the case of OpenAI, tokens consumed, or basically Sora licenses or accounts, I should say. You've got this very fast outcome loop, and so for something that might look very successful from the outside, like Sora looks awesome, if they're not actually getting those outcome metrics that they want, and the outcome metrics are much higher for codecs, or the strategy shows that they could be as they extrapolate it, or there's competitive pressure. They basically reallocate to that particular value stream. And so I think what good looks like in this era is, again, that very fast feedback loop that's connected to outcomes. And even though, let's say, in the case of OpenAI, maybe they're it's hard to know how much of it was actually cost. One of the constraints you can have is cost related, right? So obviously, video models are going to consume a fair amount of both training and inference, and that's really what outcomes are about. Is like that input is cost. When we extrapolate that, are we going to get the right kind of customer outcome from this value stream, let's say video, versus from this one, which is coding? And I think that's exactly the kind of, and this is where the concept of the outcome tree, so these multiple value streams structured into a tree, where let's say the tree that OpenAI is, you're going to have all the consumer stuff, you'll have coding, you'll have enterprise stuff, and so on. Those will have their separate products under them. These trees tend to be fairly simple. I think every organization has to understand what the tree of value streams and products is, and then look at the ones which are actually gaining traction as customers shift, as the technology shifts, and the ones which are not. And that you have to basically have this connectivity to outcomes to understand, okay, revenue, retention, customer activations or new signups are going like this, costs are going like this, and such. And it all has to be instrumented, right? Because the cost profiles are changing so quickly, depending which models you use, depending on what's basically happening with the capabilities of the models. So again, the kind of instrumentation visibility you have to understand, is this thing on a successful trajectory, on a failure trajectory, is much higher than it was in that Internet 2.0 era. And that's why I really worry about these organizations placing these massive bets. Okay, like we're going to go agentic everything and get all their engineering teams to change everything without a feedback loop of what's working, what's not.
Yeah, and I want to pivot and talk a little bit more about like the kind of management side rather than the leadership side, because we're really talking about that kind of organization level. But before I do, the one thing that I wanted to ask was, we're talking about the shift from outputs to outcomes, and I wonder like what the bottleneck you see is there now. Like you mentioned decision making, and I feel like that's probably the place, like the organizations that can make good decisions at speed are going to be the ones that kind of thrive in this era. But what is the kind of core tenet there for you?
Yeah, I think it boils down to good decisions at speed, which means you need feedback, but it's at speed and at scale, because organizations are already, many are sizable. If we look beyond new startups, which will grow up digital, AI native, so they'll probably be okay. So we really are talking about solving this problem for organizations that are hundreds or thousands or 10,000s of people. And of course, the shape of the and type of people in these organizations will evolve. But in the end, these very large organizations with complex problem domains, chances are they're going to be quite a few people in these organizations. And that's actually another thing we can tease apart. That's an interesting question. Is, are we going to turn to a world of all one-person billion-dollar organizations, or will we still have large organizations? My assumption, by the way, is we'll still continue. And I think this is important to have these large organizations, because in the end, so what we know works is these high performing teams of people and agents, whether it's 1 person, 2 people, 10 people. That's where you can now deliver just amazing value. And that was a little bit like that before, but now you can just deliver so much more with agents. So in the end, if we think of that as the sort of the atomic unit of productivity, of value delivery, of outcome delivery in an organization, the question is, how do we scale that, or what's getting in the way of scaling that? And I think in the end, if those teams are not sufficiently empowered and autonomous, they're not able to deliver at the speed they would deliver. And that's exactly when we measure what's happening in organizations today, that's exactly what you see. You've got some good people empowered with the right AI solutions, or getting there in terms of those AI solutions, but something is slowing them down, and it's always something either upstream or downstream of those teams. And those really tend to be the processes, the reviews, the budgeting, the prioritization, everything around those teams. So the question, and this is really the problem statement for outcome, is how do we structure a large organization where we have those empowered teams? Those teams have independence of action, which means they want to choose another model, they choose another model because it's going to deliver more organizational outcomes, as long as it fits into the budget. But they have authority over that, the budget they've been given, and a feedback loop to the budgeting process. So how do we basically scale that productivity of teams to really large organizations and larger problem domains? So
great.
So
and
becomes, sorry, go ahead, Scott.
No, you go.
Oh, it just becomes, it's like you said, there's the leadership question, which is kind of has to do with strategy and so on. But I think, to me, that's a hard problem. I'm not going to say that's the easy problem. That's one hard problem. The other hard problem is, how do you create the managerial structure, the organizational structure to support this?
Yeah, and that does neatly bring me onto my next question, which is what does being a good engineering manager look like in this era? There's a bunch of engineering managers who would have grown up in the era of kind of unbounded scaling. So it's we need to deliver more features, we need to deliver more outputs, and so you need more engineers. And so they got really good at hiring, and they got really good at running big teams like that. And that's where lots of the kind of current processes and mental models that we have came from. Now in this era, what does a good manager look like? What sort of skills are they expected to have?
Yeah, that's a super interesting point, right? Because you're making me reflect on the fact that for the various VP of engineering and engineering leaders I've hired, one of my top 2 criteria was always hiring, and of course the cultural aspects of hiring. But that's definitely changed, right? A lot of organizations, even very successful ones, whereas previously it was all around hiring net new people and onboarding net new teams, now it really is around adapting to the amplification you can have on existing teams. So yeah, so the chapter, I tried to capture all these ideas in a chapter and with these in the book. So the chapter for this I made is the managers to makers, it's called. But where really the core idea of that is that it's no longer around just managing people, right? If an engineering manager, their entire focus is hiring, onboarding, performance reviews, and all that HR stuff, that's really changing, right? Because you can now, in the end, if you're going to support this elite team of people and agents, you actually have to understand that technology. You have to help both your team and, I think, get directly involved in creating really the right both, and it's like socio and technical architecture, which means kind of the right combination of people, technology, access to data for your teams to deliver these outcomes and to be directly connected to those outcomes, right? Because if you want autonomy, in the end, I think engineering leaders, team leaders right now, I said they should have independence of actions and autonomy and power of their teams. If you want that, you actually have to provide transparency to how you're delivering on that overall strategy. So all of a sudden, you have to be involved, more closely involved in much faster kind of planning loop, budgeting, basically ensure that you have telemetry for the outcomes that you're delivering. And using that, hopefully what's happening is then you're actually getting more access to more tokens, more resources, more people, more agents, and so on, as you're delivering more and more for the organization. So people now, I think there's kind of two sides of this. I almost called by the way, I always call the chapter makers to managers, because it's both. Because anyone who's just who's an individual contributor now has, as a, who came from that kind of building things themselves, as I did, now they have all these kind of product management and strategy and planning aspects of their job. Because if the agents are building all these things, in the end, as a maker, you're now managing a set of agents and people and agents. So I think what's happening is that line between making and managing is just blurring completely. And I think the people who have, and this is my experience, I think this will evolve, the people who have an engineering background are actually unique, but can kind of bridge that gap to more of kind of the product thinking and some kind of more strategic and planning pieces. They're just really uniquely positioned to be the right sets of leaders for their organizations. Because if we look at the way value is being created today and outcomes are being delivered today, it's actually it's still very technical, right? Like, the understanding how agents work together, MCP, data fabrics, data graphs, ontologies, those are pretty technical concepts. Understanding the dependencies between what you're building and a service you're consuming, and changes in a frontier model and so on. Those are all things that engineers are uniquely suited to understanding, because there's a lot of systems thinking and technical aspects to that, even though it's not coding anymore, right? It still feels quite similar to the kind of the wiring that we're doing of these systems. And so I think, right, the key thing is for those engineering managers to open up the aperture to make sure that where they're learning, where they're getting help from, really the mentoring from people and from AI to help them progress on their career is around kind of that product management and leadership side of things. Because I think that's what will really help these organizations, is to help those first and second line engineering managers step up to leading larger value streams of humans and agents.
Yeah, and I haven't seen evidence of it yet, but like, it feels like the natural next step to me, especially with the way the job market is going, is that you end up with more engineering founders. And you're a company founder. Like, do you think that we're going to see an explosion of companies getting built because it's easier to get from idea to reality now?
Yeah, I think that's another great question. I think so. Yeah, I was an engineer, just a kind of heads down individual contributor developer and researcher. I was in my PhD at the time, but spending most of my time, frankly, building open source and a little less on research, to my supervisor's chagrin. But I think, yeah. So I've seen what that's like, which is basically having the more technical background and then building up the organization from that, versus kind of, the MBA background and building up an organization that way. So I think this is where it's a little bit harder to predict, because it has to do with how things are being financed and so on. But I do think my view and my advice to people early in career is that, yes, I think I agree with what you're saying, Scott, is that engineering, systems thinking, computational mindset is actually going to be a very good starting point for starting a business, as long as you bridge that gap to kind of the business and strategy and so on. So I was advising one person yesterday who wanted to found a company. They've been a successful engineering leader, but either they need to pair up with someone who understands the process of customer development, because in the end, if you're delivering outcomes, it really is around developing the customer, hypothesis testing, understanding markets, understanding customer acquisition costs. Those things have not changed quite as much. So you either need to develop that in yourself or partner with someone who's got that.
Yeah, and the bottleneck there is pretty tangible. It's funding, and there is just less funding than there was a decade ago.
And there's that. So that's the other side of the business is basically, are you going to be able to grow this thing on revenues? Are you going to go for seed funding? Are you going to become a part of an incubator? So I think those dynamics have not changed. And I think you're right. It was when we were kind of entered that 2.0 area. So I founded TaskUp in 2007. We actually ended up bootstrapping and growing the thing on revenues for the first 7 years, before raising like 3 rounds of VC funding and then continuing that on that journey. But yeah, that's kind of a fundamental question. Are you going to try to grow it on revenues, or are you going to look for some kind of seeder venture funding. And that has not gotten easier because so much of the money is chasing the at scale stuff.
Yeah, and could you have done that bootstrapping if you were spending lots and lots of money on tokens?
Yeah, so that's right. I think that's the other thing. So back then, and there's this. I think there's kind of two. There's just you've always got barriers and constraints to building a company,
Yeah.
right? Back then there was just a lot of let's say consumer companies. But when I was starting my company, I realized that kind of the investing in sort of the customer acquisition and marketing side of things to be a consumer company was just going to be so hard to rise above the noise, right? And so that was a major constraint. So we actually decided to go the more of the enterprise route and work with large organizations. And rather than going for $100 a year average deal sizes, to go for 100,000, right? That's ballpark. Now I think you've got similar challenges, right? It is hard to rise above all the noise in AI right now, which does have to do with awareness, and then that turns into customer acquisition. And the fundamentals back then, it was kind of infrastructure and then cloud hosting costs. Now that's harder. The token costs can easily go higher. So, that said, I think the capabilities of what you can do with some of the smaller and faster models are also substantial. So, some of these problems don't show up till you're further along proving things out. So I would definitely not discourage people to pursue their ideas based on the cost of tokens. But yeah, this is again why having that clear understanding of your outcome loop. If you're early stage, I actually would recommend a lean canvas around it as well. So kind of that Steve Blank startup owner's manual approach to it, where you're actually looking at, okay, given our cost, what we can extrapolate as it's like kind of token and customer acquisition costs, and because the engineering costs themselves are going down, these other things are still substantial. How do we build a successful product and business?
Yeah. And then my last question about the book is there's a lot of ideas and frameworks in there. It's one thing I really like about it is that there's you keep kind of coming back to this thing of if you're going to do this at a whiteboard, or if you're going to do this within your organization, here's how I would do it. The book opens with a prompt that you can kind of use. It's very, very practical and applicable. The question I have is have you stress tested any of those ideas out in the real world, or got kind of colleagues or friends to stress test those ideas, and what have they fed back?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because there's quite a bit in there. I'm glad you're saying it's very applicable, because I did put it in, it's 10 models. It's a lot in that sense. But again, you can choose either one. And Scott, as you're saying, each one is meant to be simple enough to put on a whiteboard. But yeah, every single model in the book is something that I've leveraged at scale with my own teams basically, and the companies I've been a part of. And every one of those models is also something that I've had colleagues at scale companies adopt at scale as well. So I think that part is key. Now, some of these things are, the question really becomes, obviously, in terms of adopting them in a more AI native way. Well, we've only got 3 years under our belt of that, right? Because no one was really, in terms of the community that I work with, and of course, in the case studies, I go to the people who got the earliest access, right? So people who started reorganizing their teams before the ChatGPT demo because they had early access and so on. But the API access, and they were just early to the changes. So I think again, the book is careful around the models that have scaled for us in leading up to the age of AI. The ones that myself and my peers have adopted during these last 3 to 4 years. But of course, there are still some open questions around that. Again, the book does not tell you to have whether you should have 40 or 4 or 1 person on a team, right? That those things are still evolving, and people are still stress testing that. And I've seen every variation of it. Like the rest of us, learning and talking to people about what's working well, what's not. So it really is around that kind of that next layer up, because I think there are things over the next 3 to 10 years that will get stress tested very differently, both in terms of what we see as successful patterns of agents and humans working together, and again, of where the capabilities of the models and agentic frameworks end up. So,
yeah. And then my last question is bigger picture, but from this conversation and from reading the book, like you seem broadly positive or at least realistic about where things are going. And so my question is there anything that concerns you or worries you about this shift that you maybe, you didn't have scope for in the book?
yeah, I think the positive part of the book is that, or like the whole, the framing for me personally, which comes across in the book, I should say, is that there's this huge power and wave coming, this huge disruptive wave, and things can go in the way where this basically creates a better economy for all or a worse economy for all. But no matter what, it's happening, right? So I think if we look at past ages and technological revolutions, which there's some examination of in the book, we either end up with kind of quick adoption across industries, so quick diffusion, or we end up with concentration in the hand of a handful of $10 trillion companies 10 years from now, right? Or even less, 5 years from now. And so the book is really all around, okay, let's adopt these things as quickly as we can at an organization level so that we get as quick a diffusion of the wealth generation parts of AI as we can. So what worries me is that we won't, right? So that was the motivation of writing the book. And there is this concern is that with every technological revolution, we're actually getting the companies at kind of at the top, the hyperscale companies, are concentrating more and more wealth than previously. And that actually happened through oil and then the age of software, now the age of AI. So I think we do need to have the shift. We are hearing people in frontier labs talking more around the importance of diffusion. They're realizing that, even their growth will top out if there isn't diffusion. And if you want economics that support the current subsidized tokens that you have out there, you need companies and enterprises to adopt around this, right? So I think we all need this to happen. And my hope is that the book and of course all the other efforts people have around this as well helps some of that diffusion. But I think the concern is that sort of the default mode is we actually get very slow diffusion, very fast concentration. That means we actually have fewer jobs because there's, in technology and in the economy in general, because companies are adopting it too slowly, or seeing the benefits too slowly, and then it becomes too easy for kind of an at scale or a new AI native company to move into that market and so on. So that's that's kind of the flip side of my hope and optimism is that because AI makes things actually easier to diffuse, we'll diffuse it more quickly. And the kind of the pessimism and the concern is, well, things diffuse way too slowly in the Internet 2.0 era. So,
got it. All right, Mik, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. Your book is out on July 14th. It's called Output to Outcome. But yeah, thanks again and have a good rest of your day. And I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
My pleasure. Yeah, pre-order anywhere, Amazon. It's all available now. The final copy went to print a couple of weeks ago. So it'll be out there soon. So thanks a lot. That was a great discussion, Scott.
Congratulations. All right, speak soon. Bye-bye.
I really hope you're enjoying this video. Do you know LeadDev offers way more than this?
I'm a fan of the LeadDev newsletter. I find really practical knowledge about leadership.
Then I was like, oh, there is this big community here doing all of these content, so let me figure out a little more, let me dig in a little, what do you have?
So make sure you check out leaddev.com.